Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
One of Australia's leading beer judges.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
The difference between getting good quality fresh hops, it just translates straight through into the beer.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. In this episode of the podcast, we meet Yalumba's head of winemaking, Louisa Rose. First released in 1966, every vintage of Yalumba, the Signature, Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz has been dedicated to an individual who has made a significant contribution to the culture and traditions of Yalumba, one of Australia's most important family-owned wineries. In 2020, Louisa was announced as that individual who would be the signatory on the newly released Yalumba the Signature 2016. Louisa Rose joined Yalumba in 1992. Previously honoured as Winemaker of the Year by multiple organisations, she is the current chair of the Australian Wine Research Institute and a Grand Master of the Barossa Valley fraternity, Barons of Barossa. In a moment, you'll hear from Louisa how the signature traditions began at Yalumba and the significance of this wine, a great Australian red, as previously explored with Matthew Jukes on this podcast.
Well, it started in 1966 when the then Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, was at an Adelaide Stock Exchange dinner. And the Yalumba 1961 Galway Vintage Special Claret was being served at that dinner. And he stood up and he announced that the best red wine he had ever tasted was, in fact, that wine. I've heard anecdotally that, in fact, he was asked a tricky question by a journalist and that was his answer for dodging it. But whatever reason he made that claim, of course, he's gone down in the history of Yalumba as, what a great sort of, unasked for little bit of advertising you might have got. And so in 1966, we were about to release the 1962 Galway Reserve Claret, as it was at the time. And so we changed the sort of the concept of that to be called the Signature. Samuel Smith was the first signatory that went on that, or his signature went on that, and his story became synonymous with that wine. It's an announcement which, the whole company sort of, waits for with bated breath, because it's always somebody that those of us working here know. Sometimes it's a very public person. In 2012, for example, it was our current owner and managing director at the time, Robert Hill Smith. As I say, sometimes very well known, like Robert, but sometimes somebody that's not so well known. So we've had vineyard managers that have worked in the company for over 40 years that the winemakers and production people, of course, know, but wouldn't be so well known outside of the immediate winemaking area. But it's always, it's always a really sentimental thing and quite humbling, when it's your name that's announced.
Now, you said in the press release, I can't quite believe that I'm about to become part of that group. You've been there since 1992. It must be about time by now, surely.
Well, occasionally people would say, when's your name going to be on the back label? I said, not for a long time, I suspect, because it is a company where people often spend their career here and their working lives. And there are so many, people that have, been here longer than I that I'm still working with. And it's, not only do we celebrate the signature each year, but we celebrate people that have, get to their 21 years of working for the business and 30 years and 35 and 40 and 45. And every now and again, somebody that's been working for the Hill Smith family and for Yalumba for 50 years. And so it is full of legends and stories and wonderful people. So I don't think, since 1992 necessarily qualifies for that long. Maybe I'm just trying to pretend it's not really that long.
You've mentioned some of the things that you've really enjoyed about working at Yalumba, but what have been the things that have really kept you there, do you think, for such a long period of time?
Well, part of it, of course, is the Hill Smith family. People become really loyal to a family that has great vineyards, great wines, great stories, but also that ability to look after people and as I say, the community. It's part of the fabric of the Barossa. But it is more than that. And over the time I've been here, it's the business has grown. It's become an international business. Our wines have, not that they were, of course, being exported before that, but as part of the Australian wine industry that since the 1990s has also become really prominent on the world stage of wine. It's been a great opportunity to look at, both traditional regions and new regions, to look at, to work with really old vine vineyards and new vines and new varieties. So one of the varieties that Yalumba is really well known for example, is Viognier, which is something that, we still talk about being a new variety compared to, some of the older varieties that we've had in Australia for 170 years or more. But, Viognier we've only been working with since 1980. So, tradition and innovation, it's that wonderful sort of blend of the two, which, makes Australian wine, but also, particularly, working at Yalumba, such a pleasure.
I assume that you would have had an opportunity to, taste some of the museum signature wines from time to time. How has that wine evolved stylistically, do you think?
It's a really good question. So I think evolve is a great word, because wines do evolve. Every wine evolves, and, the great wine brands of the world, are not static. If they were, they would lose their relevance. And I think, evolution of wine styles and sometimes, revolution is important as well. The signature has always been in that what we talk about, and we don't use the word, publicly really anymore, but that sort of claret style. So that dry red style that Australia was, really well known for, right through the 1900s, and of course into the 2000s. In the case of the signature, it's usually been a Cabernet Shiraz blend, and it is since the mid-90s, it's absolutely been from the Barossa. Usually had Barossa fruit in it, but the early signatories were blends of, often of different regions, often of Kunawara Cabernet and Barossa Shiraz. But as the world has become more focused, and the Australian wine industry absolutely, on regional identity, it's evolved into becoming a Barossa wine. And the evolution of the use of oak in wine around the world has also been part of the style of that wine. So it had a phase there through the 90s, like many Australian wines did, of using a lot more new oak. And even though new oak is still an important part of the wine, it's now only about 25% of the wine. So that evolution has continued. And while it's always had a significant amount of oak made by the Yalumba coopers, and Yalumba, that is one of the unique things about Yalumba. We have our own cooperage here, we have our own coopers, and we make a significant percentage of the barrels that we need. The Yalumba signature these days is only matured in Yalumba coopered oak. And it's a mixture of oak from France and from Hungary and from America. So it's not, we don't just focus on one company, but we do focus on it all being bent and toasted here in our Yalumba cooperage.
You mentioned how the signature is made in a claret style. Maybe you could just give me a bit more detail around how you would describe what an Australian claret is, because it's a term that gets bandied around a fair bit, but when you actually read up on it, it's also kind of vague, I find, as well, in terms of the varieties that you can use and the breadth of, stylistic range there is under that one sort of nebulous term.
Yeah, and I need to be quite clear that claret is a now protected word and has been for a couple of decades, and it's part of the words that the Europe has as a collective term, and it typically referred to wines coming from Bordeaux into England. So it was very much, that was what a claret was. But like most of those, what are now protected words and descriptions, like champagne and Burgundy and port and sherry and all of those words, that Australia used them for many years to describe our styles of wines. However, it's so much a part of the history of Yalumba. And if you go into our museum that you mentioned earlier, we have a beautiful collection of, old wines, many of which are labelled claret, right back to the early 1900s, those Galway clarets that I referred to before. In Australia, and particularly at Yalumba, were usually blends of Cabernet and Shiraz, where Cabernet gives us, structure and aromatic that you would expect. I always think about Cabernet as being quite a serious variety. It's got that lovely sort of tannin structure, cooler flavours, and, like sort of, the greener mulberry, sometimes minty, sometimes eucalyptus sort of characters, often that dark sort of chocolate, but a very sort of serious, stand up straight sort of variety. And then Shiraz being a bit softer and a bit rounder, a bit more fun. And I always, in my mind, I think about Shiraz sort of, wrapping around the Cabernet and giving it a cuddle and saying, don't be quite so serious, Cabernet. We can make a really long-lived wine together but one that is eminently drinkable from the day it's made for, in many cases, 10, 20 plus years.
They fell out of favour for quite a while, didn't they, Cabernet Shiraz blends?
Yeah, I think the problem was that as Australians we were drinking styles, but in some cases, we were seeing our parents drinking styles. So, wine is also about fashion, and generationally we typically, we want to do something different to what the previous generation did. So, that I think is always part of things, perhaps, as you say, falling out of favour. But then, as we signed that bilateral trade agreement with Europe, in the early 1990s, I think, when that was signed, late 80s, early 90s, and there was agreement to phase out some of those descriptions and some of those stylistic terms. Australia became more focused on labelling by variety, and labelling by blends was just a bit more of a difficult story. So many wines that might have been blends in prior vintages became single varietal wines. And Shiraz became, the darling of a lot of Australia, and particularly in the Barossa. And, a lot of wineries just stopped making the blends. So Cabernet Shiraz Cabernet blends in some cases became straight Cabernets, depending on where they were from. Others became straight Shiraz. So it was only sort of the diehard people that really, like Yalumba, not exclusively, but we were certainly one of the champions of maintaining that blend. And the Signature has been the champion of those wines over the years for us.
Do you remember any internal conversations around the importance of that blend historically to Yalumba?
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons we've been so keen to maintain it, because not just the conversations, but because of the continual family ownership, our archives, our museum of wines. We have the ability to go back and look at all that history, to see that we've been buying Cabernet from Eden Valley growers, for example, since the late 1800s, and blending it with Shiraz. We see those wines. We don't have wines back in the 1800s in that style in our museum, but we certainly do from the early 1900s. We know we were buying Cabernet grapes and wines from friends in Kunawara in the 1920s to blend with Barossa Shiraz. And, we taste those wines, I'd like to say regularly. It's perhaps not as regularly as we'd like, but we don't have a lot of them left. But we do see them in some of our special museum tastings over the years from the 1940s and the 1950s. And those wines are amazing. And, we know the history, we taste the history, and it all sort of bundles up into how, the styles that we want to make now, and as you said before, that evolution of wine, to make sure that not only are we respecting history, but we're making wines that are still really relevant to, today and to the future. And, for the next generation, as they come around, to how do we make it relevant and not be something that's just seen as something old-fashioned and part of history.
You must have noticed, though, within Yalumba that the conversation around the Great Australian Red that Matthew Jukes and Tyson Stelzer have sort of started has probably helped, that whole style come back into favour a little bit more recently.
Yeah, I think that, and they've done an incredible job of doing that, and it's it's always really helpful if you've got more than just one company or one wine to focus on that. That's for sure. And those two have done a great job. That Great Aussie Red has been a great story. It's been a term that many of us have adopted in our vernacular to talk about it. And the other thing, of course, about that, about the blend of Cabernet and Shiraz, is that it is pretty much an Australian blend. It's not something that that we've copied another region or another country doing in Europe, which does give it a sort of a special place in our hearts.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's Mediterranean tonic for a more delicate touch on some of the fine Australian gins you've heard discussed on the show. Now, you mentioned earlier on that the Signature should be a wine that's drinking really well upon release. Has that been something that Yalumba's become more focused on in recent years as, people sell wines less and less, I think, as time goes on, don't they?
I can't believe that it hasn't always really been important for wines to always be delicious and drinkable. And I say that because great wines are always great. You know, they don't suddenly become great. Wines don't suddenly become in balance at a certain amount of time. You know, when I hear people say, "Oh, you know that this wine will, don't worry, it'll evolve and it'll be beautifully balanced in 5 years' time." I'm going, well, how can it be balanced in 5 years' time if it's not balanced now? I know as a winemaker that you know when wines are going to be fantastic unless you do something wrong and make a mistake. You can tell when you're tasting the grapes. You can tell from the really early times during fermentation and as those wines age. And sure, they evolve, but they're in balance and they're delicious and they're great from the day that they're made. Where in that age of a wine, whether it be 1 year, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, people enjoy them most is a very individual thing. It's a very personal thing, but it is about. Wine should always be delicious and drinkable, and I can't see that winemakers wouldn't have always thought that. Certainly, there have been changes in styles, and wines, have evolved, through being perhaps more alcoholic or more tannic, or having more new oak and less new oak, and all those sort of things, which change the expression of a wine at a given time in its life. But I can't believe that winemakers haven't always wanted people just to open their wines and enjoy them. And I'm not sure, we talk about not cellaring wine as much as we used to, but I still think that cellaring wine is probably a fairly small percentage of people. I think most people, certainly they do now, and I don't really think it would have changed all that much over the decades. I think most people would just buy wine and assume that they can just open it and drink it, and why shouldn't they? Everything else we do in life is about buying something and doing it. You don't go and buy your Maserati and say, well, I'm not going to drive it for 2 years because it'll drive better in 2 years' time.
Yeah. In recent times, Yalumba's actually released another Cabernet Shiraz blend, which is the Kaylee. Tell me about the origins of the Kaylee, because that's become a really important wine for Yalumba as well.
It has, and the Kaylee is a wine that we've released first in 2017 from the 2012 vintage. So the 12 vintage was our first release, and we've just released our fourth release of the 2015. And the Kaylee is another Cabernet Shiraz blend, and it is a blend of Kunawara Cabernet and Barossa Shiraz. So I mentioned before that in our history, often the Signature and some of our other wines, were blends of different regions. And Kunawara Cabernet and Barossa Shiraz is a blend that we've known, for 100 years or more. What a beautiful blend it could be, and it was. Our decision to make the Signature a Barossa wine was, about the beauty of Barossa and single region. But in the back of our minds since the mid-90s, we knew what a great blend also Kunawara Cabernet and Barossa Shiraz were for different reasons and all of those things. And they're the two regions, Kunawara and Barossa, that Yalumba have huge history with, huge knowledge of. Absolutely understanding the beauty of Cabernet from Kunawara. Since the early 90s, we have owned Cabernet vineyards in the Kunawara, as well as purchasing grapes. So we really felt in 2012, a magic vintage, that the time was right to start to explore, that beautiful blend of the two regions again. Kunawara Cabernet has its own expression, which is a bit different from Barossa Cabernet. Barossa Cabernet has lovely, aromatics. It's got those sort of dark chocolate sort of characters. But Kunawara Cabernet also has that lovely sort of expression that comes from more of the maritime influence that Kunawara has, even though it's not that close to the sea. It's about 80 kilometres from the sea. It's still, such a beautiful sort of low altitude area. It gets a huge influence from those sea fogs that come right off that Southern Ocean. That gives it that beautiful sort of oyster shell sea spray character that overlays it. So a different expression of Cabernet to the Barossa, very, very aromatic with its sort of mulberries and mint characters. And so blended in with Shiraz, we just think that makes a wine that's, that is a different spectrum to what the Signature is. And the Kaylee is also, typically has a higher percentage of Cabernet in it than the Signature does. The Signature is always Cabernet dominant, but usually somewhere in the 50%. For example, the 16 Signature is 53% Cabernet. But the 2015 Kaylee, which we've just released, is 74% Cabernet. So it's still that blend, but it has a slightly higher fingerprint of Cabernet influence in it.
The vintage of the signatory bearing your name is the 2016. Tell me about that vintage for Yalumba.
So a 16 vintage was, was quite a benign vintage really, which is what we love. We had, what we like in winter, which is, some good rains. We had, warm, even dry springs, so no frost, which is always good. Quite sort of even temperatures. So it was fairly dry. We had a little bit of summer rain in a fall, which is not unusual for us. We are a very dry, Mediterranean summer climate here, which is perfect for grape growing. But every now and again, we will get that little bit of tropical weather that comes down and just freshens everything up. So that happened in January, which was perfect. And, really it was just one of those lovely sort of vintages where everything worked well, everything came in at the right sort of pace, and we've made some delicious wines from it.
A vintage befitting your name then?
A perfect vintage.
Now, what about outside of Yalumba? What are the wine styles that you're most excited about drinking at home, and what does your cellar look like at home?
My cellar, yes. Well, I've always had this dream of actually cataloguing my cellar and knowing exactly what's in it, and I've never quite got around to doing that.
Well, if you have a need to catalogue it, then that's got to be it must be in yours is a lot bigger than mine is.
It's got all sorts of things in it, so it's got everything from, German Rieslings, which, I absolutely love. That beautiful sort of tension between acidity and natural, residual sugar and, the purity of those wines, through, some of the older regions of Europe. But then it's got a lot of Australian wines in it as well. It's got everything from Pinot Noirs from Tasmania, to, the full-bodied, red wines of the Barossa. When I'm drinking at home, if it's something I just need a glass or two of while I'm cooking, it's probably, an Eden Valley Riesling or a Barossa Grenache. But that smorgasbord of beautiful sort of foods and options we have for cooking with in Australia is, I think should be reflected in your choice of wines, and it is for me as well. I've said this before, and I don't practice it probably as well as I should, but we seriously, you could drink a different wine every day, and never have to come back and drink that same wine again. The options of wines and styles and varieties out there is so enormous, and it's a real privilege for us in Australia, I think, to have so much availability of great wine.
What's coming up for you over the next few years? What are the projects at Yalumba that you're most excited about working on?
Good question. This concept of making sure that, wines are relevant. The stories and the history are, incredibly important as part of the fabric of what we're doing. But, that doesn't, your wines don't stay relevant without a lot of work. And that involves, continuous improvement in vineyards, making sure that, that the old vine vineyards stay really healthy, that we're not inadvertently introducing, pests and diseases, to them. They're like looking after antiques, some of those vines. So that's a really important, ongoing project. Maybe doesn't sound quite as sexy as new varieties and things like that, but incredibly important. As is, continuing to make sure that, that wines and wine balance and, then the oak that we're using, is making the best wines we can. So, knuckling down and just continually improving is sometimes as important a project as something really exciting like a new variety.
That sounds like a good note to finish on. Thanks so much for joining me on the Drinks Adventures podcast, and congratulations again on being the signatory on the new release 2016 Yalumba The Signature.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have the opportunity to enjoy the wine.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at by James Atkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.